Okay, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you once again and welcome to our plenary lecture. For me, it's a big pleasure to be moderator to this first plenary lecture. I think it's quite difficult to start a new series of plenary lecture after lunch and course after the plenary lecture to give us by call. But I'm convinced that our guest for this series, that I placed strategically into our events program, will provide memorable moments. So, welcome to our university for everybody, and we'll start our plenary lecture with a presentation that has a very interesting title, Silence Propaganda, and a semiotic inquiry into ideologies and of Taciturnity. This intriguing topic will be presented by our colleague and friend, Massimo LEONE. Massimo is a professor of semiotics and cultural semiotics at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Turin, Italy. And I could tell you such a lot of things about Massimo, but I resume with small things. Massimo has a PhD in religious studies from the Sorbonne in France, and also another PhD in art history from the University of Freiburg. I think in Freiburg, Massimo, you actually meet with another Romanian thinker. It's about, Victor Evanistor. It's
my mentor.
Yes. And Massimo had write 10 books as a single authors, and at least 200 articles and interview in the mass media and other scientific publications. I can talk at least an hour about Massimo achievement, but I think we should give the word to Massimo. Massimo, please take control of the audience.
Put it in that slide in front.
Thanks, Alex.
So, thank you very much, first of all, to my distinguished colleagues for organizing such a wonderful event, and also for inviting me to give this digestive talk. It's an honor that I don't deserve. So, several forces pattern communication in society. This is perfect. Some of them seek to regulate the quantity of information that members are supposed to circulate, depending on the sender, the receiver, the context, the message, the channel, and the code of communication, and above all, depending on the topic, implicit norms and explicit laws set the ideal nature of content that should be exchanged in a given communicative circumstance. The English expression too much information, often abbreviated as TMI, is used to sanction those who, in certain contexts, have violated an implicit norm of communication, disclosing more content than they were supposed to in that circumstance. Many of these norms are non-written. They are part of the common sense shared by a society and absorbed through contact with its communicative environment. Belonging to a society means also interiorizing and therefore mastering the norms that describe how much should be expressed and communicated in a given setting. Intercultural misunderstanding often arises when outsiders disclose too little or too much information if measured by insider standards. Talking about one's political opinions openly and passionately, for instance, is not only admitted in the Italian society, but it is also to a certain extent required. Engaging in a robust conversation about daily politics with relatives, friends, and even strangers, or maybe especially with strangers, is one of the favorite national pastimes, to the point that being fully integrated into the Italian society also means being able to openly and recurrently curse the current government. Piove, governo ladro, literally, it rains because the government is a thief, is a famous Italian self-ironic expression as regards the national attitude toward the political sphere. There are other countries, though, for instance, some Scandinavian ones, in which disclosing one's political views so openly and animatedly, and especially with strangers, is considered as rude and imposing. As a consequence, the archetypical Italian will frequently be considered as exceedingly self-asserting in Scandinavian social settings. Vice versa, the archetypical Scandinavian will be often judged as lukewarm in Italian circles. That is the case because the two societies have tendency to implicitly admit discrepant quantities of information in informal communicative settings as regards politics. Standards are not explicitly codified, but are nonetheless so cogent that infractions are immediately frowned upon, leading to social stigmatization and exclusion. Topics can be arranged along the spectrum depending on the extent to which society limits conversation about them. At the very liberal end of the spectrum, one finds subjects about which a social conversation is granted limitless unfolding. If such topics are cross-culturally boundless, they become perfect for intercultural conversation. Unfortunately, the more a topic is cross-culturally free from limitative norms, the less it tends to be socially relevant. A typical topic of this kind is weather. Traveling across epochs, social cultural groups, and ages, one is pretty sure that talking for hours about the current weather will not hurt anyone's sensibility. It could be even hypothesized that the British mastery of such topic is somehow related to the fact of having ruled for centuries over a huge and multifarious empire, which was so diverse as to admit only few cross-culturally legitimate topics such as weather, indeed. However, even the most mundane of topics can suddenly swerve toward dangerously contentious areas. Talking about weather, indeed, is so inert because it is talking about phenomena that are not controlled by any human agency. Nevertheless, as soon as someone hints at the fact that, for instance, this summer has been so hot, it is because of the climate change, then human agency is pushed back in the picture, and immediately a peaceful talk on weather banalities can become a heated dispute about political responsibilities of the greenhouse effect. The same goes for other small topics such as food, for instance. Food can be used as cross-cultural topic for never-ending innocuous conversation. However, as soon as conversation members start talking about which animals should or should not be transformed into food, it is pretty sure that someone's feathers will soon be ruffled. In general, no topic is so planned as to allow conversation to freely develop on it without causing any strain ever. At the same time, some topics are relatively safer than others, as experts in cross-cultural education know well. Analogously, at the other end of the spectrum, there is no topic that is doomed to generate immediate friction. On the contrary, every topic, even the most sensitive one, can become the subject of polite, tactful, and respectful conversation if the right contextual conditions are given. Nevertheless, as regards some topics, these conditions are bound to be so fragile that conversation is very likely to unfold into a wrong. That is the case especially when a multicultural conversation is held about topics that do not cross-culturally share the same level of disclosure. In most societies, for instance, talking about one's personal revenues is a big conversational mistake. In some other societies, on the contrary, the question, how much do you make, is generally considered as perfectly acceptable even among strangers, at least in some settings. When money is discussed in intercultural circles, uneasiness is therefore to be expected, since unlike weather, money is a conversation topic that societies traditionally regulate in extremely diverging ways. Some rhetorical tools, such as irony, for instance, can be used to smooth away the edges of conversation about these topics, but only to a certain extent, since the sense of irony itself varies cross-culturally. The cultural analyst must therefore map the semantic sensitivity of communities, understanding on which topics conversation is generally unrestrained, on which it is a matter of careful negotiation, and on which it is considered as absolutely taboo. Furthermore, the cultural historian must seek to explain what sociopolitical, economic, and cultural forces have produced a specific morphology of semantic admissibility. For instance, why are Italians so eager to harp on their political views, and why are Scandinavians mostly privileged about them? This exercise of pragmatic cartography does not have only a theoretical or a historical interest. Indeed, in a society that is increasingly interconnected, in which members of different communities often become virtual or physical conversation partners, understanding what are the pitfalls of intercultural sensitivity is useful and necessary in order to avoid fruitless tension. The study is interesting and even urgent also from another point of view, that which regulates the quantity and quality of information that individuals and groups circulate about a certain topic is not only implicit norms dictated by tradition, common sense, and shared community awareness. In most circumstances, the way in which societies seek to regiment the circulation of new semantic content is explicitly coded and enforced by a state-regulated system of laws and sanctions. As in no community, common sense and tradition let members talk about whatever they want, with whomever they want, whenever and wherever they want, for as long as they want, however they want. So in no state, laws let citizens share contents with any kind of limitation. Even in the most self-styled liberal societies, there are topics and pragmatic conditions about which no rules are set, but there are also subjects and conversation settings that are scrupulously regulated or even turned into taboo areas. The present-day cultural analyst, therefore, must inquire not only about how different cultures implicitly limit conversation, but also about how different states explicitly encourage or discourage public talking about certain topics, subjects, and issues. In other terms, each society both implicitly and explicitly sets a standard at which free public conversation is considered as legitimate, and on the contrary, bans as morally or even legally unacceptable sharing contents beyond such limits. The notion of sustainability has been usually associated with the impact of human initiatives on the environment. However, drawing theoretical inspiration from the semiotics of the Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman, who modeled the notion of semiosphere, as you know, after Vernadsky's concept of biosphere, one might ask, which kind of circulation of semantic content in the semiosphere is considered sustainable and which one is not? In an increasingly interconnected humanity, what implicit norms and explicit rules, if any, currently set a limit on the amount of meaning that is produced and shared by human beings? Which limitations, if any, are deemed as interculturally inadmissible, and which ones, by contrast, give rise to cross-cultural taboos and even legal interdictions? Observing how societies implicitly or explicitly encourage or even enforce silence on certain topics is an effective point of departure for such an inquiry. In what circumstances do communities consider public talk inadmissible or even prosecutable? And what methods of moral suasion and legal exactment are adopted so as to make sure that no semantic content is shared on certain issues? The paper will now concentrate, in particular, on a case study, Propaganda for Taciturnity, from Second World War onward. Literature on state propaganda is very abundant. Although the word propaganda dates back to early modern Catholicism, the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide was meant to propagate Catholicism both in Europe and its colonies, scholars have generally focused their attention on 20th century propaganda, specifically in relation to the formation, development, and activities of dictatorial regimes. The evolution of mass media between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th allowed ideologies to be communicated and spread in unprecedented ways. The history of fascism and Nazism, for instance, could not be fully understood without reference to the concept of broadcasting. An ideological sender was able to reach an immense audience simultaneously and at the same time give to each member of this audience the idea that she or he was addressed individually. Perhaps none better than media artists themselves were able to capture, sometimes even better than scholars, the power of such communication. The 1977 movie Una giornata particolare, a special day, for instance, Italian director Ettore Scola perfectly shows how an Italian housewife, impersonated by Sophia Loren, could develop a blind passion for the Duce in late 1930s while being practically secluded at home, reached by fascist radio and popular magazines. The study of autocratic propaganda before World War II has been so extensive as to actually shape the present-day disciplines of mass media studies, starting from the pioneer research of Lazarsfeld and others. Propaganda existed well before the 20th century, and actually even before the word propaganda itself was coined at the dawn of modernity. Forms of propaganda circulated ideas and motions also in the Roman Empire, for instance. Yet, it was during the first half of the 20th century that social and technological developments converged, giving rise to new impetus modalities for the transmission and diffusion of ideologies. However, despite abundant literature on fascist, Nazi, or Soviet propaganda, scholars have generally overlooked a very important issue. This issue is central not only so as to understand past propaganda, but also so as to grasp the ways in which ideologies are diffused in the present-day world. Thus far, scholarship has concentrated either on propaganda or on censorship. On the one hand, the public rhetoric is created and diffused in order to instill in citizens certain ideas, emotions, and pragmatic attitudes. On the other hand, science, texts, images, and discourses that do not align with the central political agenda are censored, banned, and outlawed. Yet, the solidification of a state ideology cannot be explained with reference to these two processes only. The fascist rhetoric, for instance, did not consist only of propaganda and censorship efforts. Activities to either circulate a positive imaginary of the regime and to chastise any counter-narratives were central. Yet, the fascist regime would have never lasted that long without an essential element, that is, silence. Scholars have often concentrated on how communication builds the social-cultural hegemony of a set of ideas, turning it into state ideology. They have equally concentrated on violence exerted in order to protect such hegemony from critiques and debunking. However, the role of silence in preserving state ideologies has generally been neglected. Silence, indeed, is not censorship. It is what comes after, but also before censorship. It is not self-censorship either. It is total lack of communication among citizens. The main hypothesis of the present paper is that any state ideology requires not only that citizens endorse it through their words, passions, and acts. All these are fundamental for the state ideology to thrive. Yet, that which state ideology needs the most is not that citizens share certain contents, but that they actually abstain from sharing them. State ideology requires a silence. That is evident in autocratic regimes, in fascist Italy, in Nazi Germany, in Nicolae-Ceausescu's Romania, but also in present-day states like China, Iran, or North Korea. Huge state efforts are made not only to propagate the ideological tenets of the regime, and not only to detect, censor, and repress dissidents, but also and especially to make sure that people keep silent about certain areas of private and public life. The ultimate goal of the public rhetoric of silence is that citizens do not actually feel the urge to talk about something. They have internalized the ideology of silence so deeply that the limits of their everyday conversation appear as totally natural to them as a sort of second nature. Incidentally, since it was mentioned earlier, one of my earliest and most important contacts with Romanian history and culture consisted in having had the great honor to have as a doctoral supervisor and mentor a great Romanian scholar, Victor Stoichița, a famous art historian working at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland. In the last chapters of his wonderful biography, published in French in 2014 under the title Oublier Bucharest, Forgetting Bucharest, Stoichița evokes the dramatic consequences of the Law 14 passed by the Romanian government in March 1972. The law would prohibit Romanians to talk to foreigners without official permission, punishing infraction with stiff prison and fines up to 5,000 lei. The average monthly salary at that time was 1,200 lei. Silence is a universal feature of human communication. There could not be communication without silence. Literature on the philosophical and linguistic nature of silence is therefore also very abundant. Nevertheless, the role of silence in shaping state ideologies has been often neglected. Scholars have concentrated on what societies talk about and have usually omitted studying the ways in which areas of secrecy, silence, and non-communication are created in a semiosphere. Moreover, although silence is a transhistorical and cross-cultural feature of human communication, its quality changes depending on the various communicative contexts. It changes especially in relation to the evolution of technology of communication. The role of public rhetorics of taciturnity has completely changed, for instance, in the present-day communicative era, wherein individuals constantly share contents, ideas, and emotions through the social networks. Both the Assange and the Snowden affairs point at the new critical limits that states seek to impose on public conversation, not only in autocratic regimes, but also in societies that are supposed to champion democracy, transparency, and free speech. The present paper will, as a consequence, aims at casting new light on present-day public ideologies and rhetorics of taciturnity through analyzing their history and semiotic evolution from the Second World War to on. From World War II on. On June the 30th, 1941, Italian movie theaters screened Giornale Luce, literally News Real Light, number 147. Giornale Luce was the fascist newsreel produced by the Luce Institute in Rome since 1927. Preceded by a dramatic soundtrack, a giant right ear appeared on the screen. It was cited by Nicolae's gigantic hand, cocking the ear towards spectators. A white spiral rapidly whirling on the screen was meant to attract their eyes toward this giant ear. A sentence started to appear, superimposed in white on the image with the typical Mostra font of fascist typography, rapidly filling the screen. The sentence read, "Comrades, you who are forging in the factories, literally in the workshops, the weapons and means of victory, remember that you are fighters among fighters. Do not let anything escape your mouth that refers to your work, to our work production, and to everything you see and hear during your quotidian work." End of quotation. The giant ear then cross-faded into a cave, and the cave vanished into the image of a plane sinking a military vessel. The newsreel ended with one of the most famous slogans of fascist propaganda. Tacete, il nemico vi ascolta. Tacete, with tacete repeated twice. Keep quiet, the enemy is listening to you. Keep quiet. In the previous month, the Italian Navy had indeed suffered heavy losses. On February 25th, 1941, British submarine HMS Upright has sunk the Italian cruiser Armando Diaz. On February 27th, the New Zealand division cruiser HMS Leander had sunk the Italian army merchant rider Ram I of the Maldives. On May the 24th, just a month before the newsreel described above was screened, the British submarine HMS His Majesty Upholder had torpedoed and sunk the Italian ocean liner SS Conte Rosso, used as a troop ship by the Italian government. The newsreel, directed by Italian film director Arnaldo Ricotti, was actually part of a series of 4. The first, number 156, was screened in early June 1941. The last, number 159, on July 7, 1941. The first 2 were directed by Ricotti, the last 2 by Italian director Arturo Genniti. They have different targets and showed slight variations, but all focused on the same message. Silence was the best weapon against espionage and sabotage. They all adopted the image of the monstrous ear and the same slogan, Tacete, il nemico vi ascolta, tacete. During the Italian fascist participation in the Second World War II, not only newsreels, but also other media conveyed the same message. The figure of the giant ear was actually a visual quotation from a poster by Gino Boccasile, one of the most fervent and prolific illustrators of fascist propaganda. In 1941, he had created a poster in which the helmeted head of a British soldier was shown in the act of cocking his ear toward the spectator, the right hand orienting the ear toward the fore of the image. The slogan Il nemico vi ascolta, tacete, was superimposed to the image with large and vivid white strokes. The same iconography and slogan circulated also on other supports. In 1942, the Italian Postal Service, Poste Italiane, produced a special postcard for the army displaying on the one side a reproduction of Boccasile's poster, while leaving the other side for writing and the address of the receiver. The intention of the postcard was clear. In communicating with their families, soldiers were reminded by the support itself of writing that they were not supposed to disclose any strategic information. Indeed, especially between 1941 and 1943, the slogan Tacete was everywhere, in newsreels, posters, postcards, but also in everyday objects like calendars and pins, using the more direct verbal form taci, second singular, while Tacete was second plural. It was also displayed in public places in which people were likely to gather and talk. In Ottardi, in the province of Salerno, one can still read today, in Via Pampuliano, the fading fascist mural Taci, vinceremo, be quiet, we shall win. The fascist iconography of silence was multifaceted. In one poster, the enemy was depicted as a spy in plain clothes, eavesdropping a bar conversation from behind an open newspaper. In another poster, the slogan Tacete was coming from an old woman in the foreground and accompanied by the message Non tradite mio figlio, don't betray my son, on the background of a battle scene. The Italian Military Intelligence Service, SIM, Servizio Informazione Militare, was multiplying counter-espionage activities in the 4 years of war from June 10, 1940 to September 8, 1943. The special tribunals prosecuted 163 instances of espionage and 293 episodes of sabotage, deploying 1,500 men under the direction of General Cesare Amè. However, this coercion alone was not sufficient. Italians had to be persuaded to keep all silent on everything. Tacere tutti su tutto. Being quiet, everyone on everything, as another slogan would read. And not only because talk was a possible source of information for the enemy, but also because eliminating public conversation was the best way to crush any sparkle of internal dissidence. There is abundant literature on Italian fascist propaganda, specifically on the imagery produced during World War II. However, the corpus of images and other messages meant to propagate a culture of silence have not made the object of in-depth investigation yet. Several aspects of it are particularly interesting. First, this propaganda had a paradoxical semiotic nature. It deployed a vast array of channels, media, and messages in order to instill in the Italian population an ideology of non-communication. Second, this effort was not a peculiarity of Italian fascist propaganda. In 1940, the DPA, Deutsche Propagandaagentur, had created an analogous poster. On the background of the factory, it depicted a worker with the head of a goose, its beak wide open. The slogan clarified the meaning of the image. Schäm dich, Schwätzer. Feind hört mit. Schweigen ist Pflicht. Shame on you, chatter. The enemy is listening. Silence is a duty. At the other end of the ideological spectrum, in 1945, the Czech Communist Party produced a poster entitled Drive collaborant nes panicar. It depicted a former collaborator with the Nazis turned into a rumor monger causing panic. The slogan of the poster read, "The traitors and fascists spread lack of faith in building the Czech state. Silence them." Although its escape encouragement was not only to passively keep quiet about the failures of the communist state, but also to actively silence its denigrators. However, this iconography of silence needs a comparative study, not only because it was deployed in several dictatorial regimes, but also and especially because it was paradoxically circulated in democracies too. Several of the posters produced and diffused, mostly in 1942-1943, by the US government printing office during World War II, focused on loose lips. The Sound That Kills, Eric Erickson, 1942. Someone Talk, Friedrich Siebel, 1942. The Enemy is Listening, William Schuster, 1942, drawing. Closed for the Duration, Loose Lips Can Cost Lives, Howard Scott, 1942. Loose Talk Can Cost Lives, Holmgren, 1942. Sailor Beware, Loose Talk Can Cost Lives, John Philip Poulter, 1942. A Careless Word, An Illness Sinking, 1942, Anton Otto Fischer. Battle Your Lip, Loose Talk Can Cost Lives. Bismarck Act Down, Loose Talk Can Cost Lives, 1942, both by Otto Sokolow. Don't Be a Dupe and Spread Inside Dupe, Loose Talk Can Cost Lives, 1942, Civil Culture Bill. Loose Talk Can Cost Lives, Stephen Bohanos, 1942. Bits of Careless Talk are pieced together by the enemy, Stephen Bohanos, 1943. Serve in Silence, Clay Stone, 1935, 1945. Some of these posters explicitly thematized the dilemma of articulating an ideology of silence with a culture of free speech. The poster "Free Speech Doesn't Mean Careless Talk" SRG 1939-1945, for instance, resorted, like the German poster, to an animal, in this case a parrot, representation of the child. SRG, Seymour R. Goff, was also the designer of that which is probably the most famous and iconic poster in the series, Loose Lips Might Sink Ships, whose slogan has become an idiomatic expression in the US. There is also plenty of analogous British posters, such as "Isn't the silent service? Are you? Watch your talk for his sake. Careless talk may cost his life. Ports are often bombed when convoys are in because somebody talked. Beware the walls have ears." Jack Lanyard and Walls Have Ears. There was an organization called Walls Have Ears between 1939 and 1945 in Great Britain. These posters, their slogans and their iconography, are semiotically interesting from several points of view. First, they represent an extremely intriguing case of visual persuasion and iconic propaganda. Second, they constitute a challenging semiotic corpus, not only because they advocate silence through verbal and visual communication, but also because in the case of US and UK silence propaganda, they strive to instill in citizens an ideology of taciturnity while heralding free speech against autocratic regimes in Italy and Germany. From this point of view, investigation of this corpus relates to the wider subject of the iconography of silence. To give an example, the figure of the giant ear can be found in the iconography of World War II Japanese counter-espionage. It reproduces a pair of Japanese
game cards of the kind known as Iroha Karuta. Iroha is a reference to a Japanese poem probably dating from the Heian period in 794 1179, whose first attestation is from 1079. This poem has the particularity of being both a pangram and an isogram, that is, it contains all the syllables of the Japanese syllabary only once. The term karuta instead transcribes the Portuguese word carta, for it was precisely the Portuguese from the 16th century on to introduce game cards in Japan. Iroha Karuta, hence, is a kind of card game based on the Japanese syllabary. Up to World War II, Japanese kids and school children used to play with these cards in order to improve their ability of reading and memorize traditional Japanese proverbs and their educational content. Cards were divided into decks of 47 plus 1 cards each. Those of the first deck would contain the text of as many proverbs, each one of which beginning with one of the different kana, and obviously Slavic transcriptions of the Japanese alphabet. The cards of the second deck instead would contain images representing these proverbs. The game would therefore measure the participants' ability to associate the cards of the first deck with those of the second. In the card reproduced in this image, however, the proverb has been replaced by a word like propaganda slogan in katakana, one of the 3 systems of syllabic transcription used by Japanese, which reads Yudan ni teki ga me wo tsu. Yudan, negligence, ni, to, teki, the enemy, ga is a particle that indicates the subject of the sentence in Japanese, me wo tsukero, to take advantage of. The enemy takes advantage of your negligence. The image on the background specifies the object of negligence. It depicts a military harbor in the upper half of the image, an airport in the lower half, with a temporal indication 1831, that is March the 1st, 1943, the production date of the card. The card on the left instead, which pairs with the first, visually indicates those who will take advantage from such negligence. First, through a reference to the corresponding Japanese word, yudani, here recalled by its first syllable, yu, well visible in the upper right corner, white on red background. Second, through the image of a gloved hand, most probably that of a spy, collecting written military information that someone incautiously left behind. And third, and above all, through the image of a blue wall from which a big eye that sees all and a big ear that hears it all emerge. As the propaganda of fascist counter-espionage, then, so also the Japanese militarist propaganda would resort to the figure of the giant ear. However, this figure was not new. One could find it already in the moralized manga of the mid-19th century, such as the famous Shingaku Osana Etoki, Illustrated Moral Philosophy for Children, by Utakawa Kuniyoshi, 1842. Entitled Kabe ni Mini Ari, literally walls have ears, part of the Japanese saying that usually continues with Shoji ni me Ari, the doors have eyes. This print was supposed to inculcate in mid-19th century Japanese children, but also in adults, through an entertaining iconography, the idea that conversation was always a potential public fact, observable and therefore censorable. The figure of the walls with ears is to be found in many traditional cultures, so that when Italian fascist posters or Japanese militarist posters, such as the one in this figure, attributed this giant ear to an enemy, invisible and pernicious spy, they did not create it ex nihilo, but reactivated instead an ancient imagery whose ramifications included in Europe also the religious iconography of sin, the giant eye of God that sees and judges everything was replaced by the giant ear of the enemy that hears everything. However, Taciturnity propaganda also alluded to the fact that while the spy eavesdropped on the incautious chatter, the regime was simultaneously watching both and would punish them consequently. Third, this corpus of Taciturnity propaganda messages constitutes a fundamental term of comparison in order to understand present-day crucial problems, such as those stemming from the often problematic relation of democratic governments with social networks conversation, conspiracy theories, data mining, etc. The analysis of the public rhetoric and propaganda of Taciturnity from World War II on will therefore entail first surveying posters and other artifacts advocating silence on certain topics as socially or legally legitimate attitude. Two, reconstructing the historical and material production context of these objects. Three, analyzing through semiotics their specific visual and verbal message, identifying their target, ideology, and expected effects. Four, comparing and contrasting Taciturnity propaganda in different countries, paying specific attention to the difference between democratic and autocratic countries. And five, proposing a gender reading of these materials. In many cases, indeed, women are explicitly or implicitly evoked as the weak link in the chain of Taciturnity. All societies impose limits on the free circulation of knowledge, information, and other semantic contents. Some of these limits are enforced for economic reasons. That is the case for copyright. One cannot freely reproduce a movie, an image, a song, or a quotation from a book. One must abide by copyright law and its prescriptions. Some other limits are imposed for moral reasons. For instance, in many societies, so-called pornography is subject to diffusion limits. However, public conversation can be restricted also for political reasons. For instance, when a country is at war with another country. In time of peace, these constraints are often relaxed, but are usually never eliminated. The constitutions of many democratic countries presently contain provisions against unlawful disclosure of information, the so-called state secret. Many of the most controversial issues of present-day societies exactly concern the tension between, on the one hand, the need to protect the freedom of speech, and on the other hand, the need to defend state interests. The situation is paradoxically complicated by the fact that while many states impose limits on the amount of content citizens can freely circulate, the same states relax limits, especially in times of international tension, on the amount of information they can gather from private conversations. Thus, on the one side, the state regiments public conversation, whereas on the other side, it monitors private conversation. In both tasks, however, coercion is never sufficient, as it was not sufficient during World War II. Laws must be accompanied by a continuous effort of moral suasion and propaganda, whose joint efforts aim at inculcating into citizens a certain ideology of speaking, at setting a specific balance between disclosure and taciturnity. Indeed, governments cannot limit themselves to enforce an ideal standard of sustainable public conversation. They must also endorse it through an ongoing propaganda effort, so as to convince citizens that, for instance, Edward Snowden was not a hero but a traitor, since his conduct imperiled national security interests. Also, as a consequence of state propaganda, citizens often show a tendency to interiorize these standards, laws, and constraints. In other words, they develop communicative habits that cease to question the rationality of such limitations. Why shouldn't the photograph of painting be freely reproduced? Why shouldn't sexuality be publicly discussed in schools? And why is military information to be kept secret at all costs? The sclerosis of these communicative habits is worsened by the fact that public conversation about them is frowned upon or even outlawed, in a vicious circle that discourages a negotiation of semantic sustainability both within a state and internationally. Research must react to such paralysis of public debate not through suggesting new standards of semantic disclosure. Ultimately, society itself must regulate the quantity and quality of information that it lets freely circulate in the semisphere. On the contrary, research must aim at showing the historical and therefore always contingent roots of existing standards and point at the possibility of alternatives. It will underline the role of governments and other institutional agencies in implicitly or explicitly advocating for secrecy and taciturnity, and point out the way in which this rhetoric and propaganda of secrecy is instrumental to the hegemonic power of certain classes or groups of interest, at least from World War II on. In the age of digital interconnectedness, no national community can abstain from painstakingly negotiating and renegotiating its standards of communicative sustainability at the international level. Nowadays, what we decide to talk or not to talk about is not a personal matter anymore, and is not anymore an exclusively national matter either, but an issue that concerns the entire and continuously ongoing global conversation. Semiotic research is meant to cast new light on present-day public ideologies and rhetorics of taciturnity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a pleasure for us to say this presentation. Now, I think we have 10 minutes for questions and some comments. So, you are invited. Please.
I guess I can talk without too much. You tended to link systematically these ideologies of taciturnity with the state. And my question is, do they work without the state? Can they work against the state eventually? And I have some examples. For instance, if someone is looking at the feminist literature on emancipation, they would find out cases when, although we have laws for, I don't know, denouncing male privileges, gaining equal rights, and so on and so forth, there is still a social consensus, quiet social consensus, that doesn't allow bringing subjects into open discussion. Subjects like equality of rights, for instance. Sorry. So this would be one interesting aspect which points maybe to a broader theoretical issues. The kind of power that you discussed meant to enforce this ideology of taciturnity is basically a kind of repressive power of the state, even if doubled by persuasion campaigns such as propaganda. What's happening if, turning back to Foucault, we try to shift to a concept of power that is not necessarily repressive but productive, a concept of power that produces the subjects, and as you've mentioned, at a certain point, people tend to internalize certain norms and ideologies and to naturalize them, consequently keeping quiet about some subjects. Thank you.
I think it's a very good it's a very good
I think it's a very good question. Imagining a society in which there are no areas of silence or non-communication or lack of exchange is, of course, utopian. I would say that in every community there is I wouldn't call it a physiological level of silence, but silence in certain areas is instrumental to keep the social cohesion in that community. At the same time, along a spectrum, you can also have swerving of this standard toward levels at which, for instance, artists are more and more expelled from the community because they are considered as those who tend to enlarge the areas of communication and work on the areas of science. There's a beautiful poster that circulated in the United States during McCarthyism. Beware of artists. They mix with all classes of society and are therefore the most dangerous. And it was a way of pointing out that artists were those who would continuously challenge the modalities and dynamics of conversation, but also the areas of silence in society. So I would say that there is always a spectrum, that a society that talks about everything is a utopia, but also a society that dangerously promotes silence and excludes, for instance, artists in public communication is, of course, a big danger.
You know, it makes me think that I'm thinking of Nicolae-Sorin, where she talks about one of the issues that comes up is, as you compare societies, the freedom to be silent. So not when discourse is silent, it gives you a free space. When I was, for instance, in America, you know, the interesting phenomenon is we can't keep, it's the old paradox. The secret, the intelligence agencies, they can't keep secrets, and they're afraid we can't keep secrets either, which sort of turns into a weird paradox. For instance, the idea that in America people go on television and reveal all to everybody about their most private lives in a sort of confessional mode, whereas in like Asian societies there would be much more respective silence, and people just don't ask certain questions about sexuality or such, and therefore, in a way, paradoxically, one is freer. So there's that.
I understand what you mean, and I completely agree with you. At the same time, I think that sometimes there is a clear state, or at least political manipulation of the standards of, let's say, communicability and secrets in a society. I'll give you an example. It's a fun example, but also a tragic one. Once Silvio Berlusconi was prosecuted, the former Italian Prime Minister, was prosecuted because he was conducting some illegal restructuring, modifications of his villa in Sardinia. And in order to avoid prosecution, he declared that his villa in Sardinia was a matter of state secret. So he enlarged the area of state secret to his Sardinian villa so that prosecution could not go on. And that is a clear manipulation of the boundary between, let's say, public space and private space, political life and personal life, that played also with the threshold between what could be publicly discussed and also legally prosecuted, and what could, on the contrary, be secretive and so had to remain outside of the reach of the law.
I'm thinking of the personal as political idea, that if you don't have some concept of privacy in places where you have a freedom to remain silent, then that's a totalitarianism of itself. Thinking of prisoners sometimes who sew their mouth shut, you know, as a form of protest, for example, if they will not speak, as an example of that.
Now, certainly, I mean, silence can be and has been in history a communication strategy of protest in many circumstances. But I think that is a phenomenon that has to be distinguished from those public, state or even governmental rhetorics that encourage people not to talk, and in a way to interiorize silence, so that silence is not anymore an intentional means of communication, but a non-intentional, let's say, passive modality of lack of public exchange.
Thank you very much. I really liked all of that paper. The only thing that I wanted to say is that are you overlooking the fact that in some Eastern cultures, silence is more than that kind of interiorizing. It's actually a positive value. In the Zhuangzi, or whatever it's called, the Taoist text, it says words are there to carry the meaning. when we know the meaning, we don't need the words. And then later on, he says, I would like to have a conversation with the man who has no more to say. So that they're actually playing there on a very positive, not a kind of default thing in Japanese culture, but I think a very positive thing. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, but silence has been the object of huge literature in philosophy of language, and also in that part of philosophy of language that deals with religious discourse, and the let's say qualities of silence in not only the Eastern culture but also the Western one. If you think about a Christian theologian like Hans Urs von Balthasar, he has books about silence as a sort of a mystical discourse. So both in the East and in the West, silence is a modality of, let's say, self-expression, or even a modality of communication, a paradoxical modality of communication that does not entail any violence. But I wanted to show these Japanese posters to you exactly to point out the fact that the idea that there is a central political agency that manipulates silence is not only present in was not only present in Germany or Italy during the Second World War, but was also a characteristic of, for instance, the Japanese militarist propaganda. In that case, too, what was the intended effect of this propaganda was not to invite or encourage citizens to develop a sort of a mystical silence in order to reach a higher level of spirituality. But of course it was simply the intent to avoid the citizens to talk to each other, reveal military information, but in general also discuss about public, political, or military issues. So my paper was not at all meant to give you the idea that silence is not endowed with positive anthropological consequences. On the contrary, although you know that Italians love talking all the time. But on the contrary, I was trying to point out that silence can be also the result and the aim of public rhetoric intended to create distance among citizens, disrupt the functioning of our community, and eventually eliminate any possibilities of protest and therefore change in our society.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I think we have time for very short question or comment on this. Yes, please.
Thank you for your speech. I think that when it relates to war, the wartime, the examples that he wrote were mostly from wartime. You can't relate to what happens today. I mean, to the positive side of talking about silence when you talk about war crimes. Because in war times, for the nation who has enemies, it's okay to say, be silent. It's not there. If you look from a peace territory to a war time, then in these days, and you can say, well, something is wrong. But be there, in that time, in that area, it's positive. You look at it as it's negative.
Well, I don't know if it's positive or negative. Now, what was I interested in was to show there is a genealogy of these rhetorics of silence that goes back, probably goes back well before the Second World War II. I mean, these rhetorics of silence changed during Cold War, but they didn't disappear. And after the so-called end of the Cold War, these rhetorics didn't disappear either. They metamorphosized into other strategies for, let's say, inculcating the idea that certain areas public speaking must become mute. I focused on war times because in war times this phenomenon is microscopic. So you can see that it is an active propaganda, rhetorical effort to instill this ideology of taciturnity. But if you analyze, Cold War as in this macarchist manifesto, or even, if you consider a poster like this one, which is a contemporary poster that plays with Uncle Sam, that has been produced during the Snowden affairs, which it's not censorship, it's freedom silence. And personally, you realize that the idea that silence can be used as a weapon persists also when, let's say, open war is not on anymore. So I don't know whether it is. It's not my, let's say, duty as a scholar to say whether societies should talk or should not talk about war. Of course, I have my opinions as a citizen. But I wanted to point out the fact that we tend not to be aware of the fact that there are things we don't talk about in our societies. It seems totally normal to us. And I think it's not normal. I mean, nothing is natural for some Christians, and so is not being silent about certain topics. Not only military information, but also other kinds of medical research and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much, Massimo. It's a great pleasure. Well, maybe we will continue the discussion after the plenary session. Thank you very much, sir.